Hi, this is Scott Gehring with EPOC Martial Arts. I'm here to talk to you today about zone theory. What exactly do I mean by zone theory, and how does it apply to the martial arts? When we talk about zone theory, it is a target-centric concept. What do I mean by target-centric? Well, one of the basic constituents of force is connecting a tool to a target. So, if we had a jab, that would be a tool. A punch. We connect it to a target. I don't know, the nose. Pow! So we shoot our jab to the nose. The jab is the tool, and the nose is the target. When we talk about zone theories, we're specifically talking about the targeting portion. As you recall, zone theory is a targeting-centric concept. But when we actually delve into the details of zone theory, there's 5 different parts to zone theory, and it's based on dimensionality, the dimensions of the world around us. Albert Einstein was very famous for his theories of relativity, in which he talked about the interconnected relationship between time and space. There are 3 dimensions of space: height, depth, and width, and 1 of time. What applies to physics also applies to combat, and we categorize the zone theory based on those dimensions. Height zones are quite simple. They divide the body vertically up and down, dimension of height. So there's 3 height zones in fighting. I have the low, the mid, the high. Each one is divided by a pivot point line. This is the hip pivot point line here. Notice the hip flexors. This divides from the low from the mid. The mid to the high is divided by the shoulder pivot point line, which is here. Notice I can move my shoulders. This is the shoulder pivot point line. That divides the high from the mid. So when you draw lines from the body, these are the height zones of targeting. It's impossible to cover all 3 height zones at once. So if someone's covering like this, high, like kind of like a Muay Thai fighter, like this, well, his 2 low zones are open. If he's covering his low zone and maybe his high zone like this, maybe he's got a knee deflection and an elbow destruction, his mid zone's open. If I got all my hands down here and I got my knee up and my high's up, so no matter what anatomical configuration you can come up with, 1 height zone is always open. There's always a target open on the dimension of height. Moving on, next are width zones. Width zones. We just reviewed height zones, which is the dimension of height. Now we're going to review width zones, the dimension of width. Width zones are probably the 2nd most important targeting zone theory we use. Why? Because it's real practical. I'll explain why. So, there are 4 width zones. 4. So if I stand like this, kind of like a robot, there are different sections of the body that get divided apart. Okay? So the shoulder to the hip is 1 line. This over here is the widest width zone, over here where I'm waving my hand. All right. Past this line here is this zone here. It's kind of like the left side of my body. This is zone 2. The center line divides the center of the body, is the separator between zone 2 and zone 3, which is the right side of the body. And then zone 4 which is the shoulder to the hip, identifies the far right zone. So I have 1, 2, 3, and 4. 4 width zones. Why is this important in a fight? Well, not all width zones are available all the time, and people will take different widths. For example, if I'm in a fight stance, I'm real tight, I got hands on my chin, classic stance, how many width zones am I exposing? 2. These 2 are gone. This one's gone and this one. Zone 1 and 4 are gone. I'm exposing 2 width zones. Okay? How about if I'm coming like this, maybe in a tackle? Coming at you like in a tackle. Well, there's 4 width zones exposed. 1, 2, 3, 4. So width zones identify the targeting width of the human body. Okay? What about something like this? What if I'm like this? I'm running in. Okay? That's 3 width zones. The width zone 1's gone. 1, 2, 3. Think about the endless possible combinations, okay? I may be trying to clothesline someone. Alright? I may be coming in, wham! Trying to clothesline someone. Guess what? If I'm going like this, there's only 3 width zones. 1, 2, 3. There's my width zones of targeting. Concept that should be brought up is the Venetian blind concept when you're dealing with width zones. So when I take height and width zones, I start playing around with the different anatomical target areas that I can hit. The Venetian blind concept kicks in. So Venetian blind concept is if I have height here, my different height zones, and I shrink my silhouette, notice the height zones shrink. So they're all still available, but they shrink. So height zones can expand and contract depending on how the person is positioned relative against you. It's the same with width. In the case I showed you before, right now there's only 2 width zones open. Right now there's 2 width zones open. But if I'm like this, depending on how I rotate, notice the width zones are available, but they expand and contract. Okay, so right now we've got 4 width zones available, but they're expanding and contracting based on my pivot. Okay, so the Venetian, that's what we call the Venetian blind concept. The ability for zones to expand and contract based on the anatomical positioning relative to your opponent. Depth zones. Depth zones are everyone's favorite, and I say that facetiously. Depth zones are one of the least understood and most confusing aspect of zone theory. Height zones, people get it. High, mid, low. Width zones, people get it. 1, 2, 3, 4, depending on how wide or how thin they are. You have different targets available. People get that. Where people struggle, including myself, I struggled this for a long time, is depth zones. How to functionalize depth zones to make them work and understand them. So I'm really going to spend a lot of time on this because this is one of the really undervalued areas. In Ed Parker's Infinite Insights, he goes into depth zones and outlines them. He spends like a page or 2 on them. He doesn't really dissect it and really pick apart the theory in at least the level of detail that I would need and many of my students need. There's another gentleman out there named James Benko. He's a Taekwondo master, military, world-class martial artist. He's got some zone theories too that I think are worthwhile following up. So it's not just Ed Parker. It's probably the kind of the core. Ed Parker's kind of the de facto standard when it comes to depth zones. James Benko's got some good stuff too. I'm going to actually even Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee in the Tao Jeet Kune Do talks about depth. And the interesting thing about depth zones is Ed Parker, James Benko, Bruce Lee. Those are the 3 that jump to mind. They all declare 7 layers of depth for combat. So some of the greatest thinkers on this topic have covered this. I'm going to make an attempt to describe with a little more visual aid how these 7 layers work in detail. I'm the right guy. height zones and width zones are looked at from a front vantage point, a POV vantage point. So when you're staring an opponent down, you can quickly assess their height and their width. Gives you a 2D contact surface area which to fight on. But we all know that opponents and fighting is not just a two-dimensional square, right? Every opponent has depth, okay? So that's where depth zones come into place, all right? The best way to look at depth zones is from the side, okay? And you may say, wow, if I'm fighting someone, I'm not going to be staring at them from the side, unless you are facing on an angular force alignment. If you're facing an angular force alignment for your opponent, if your opponent's fighting this way and I'm fighting that way, well then yes, I will be seeing from the side. So there are times and places when you are in a fight where you actually will have an angular force alignment and you will have a kind of I'm facing and their sideways vantage point. Okay? And that's where really I think the depth zones really kick in. There's 7 depth zones. Let's go through them. Start dissecting these depth zones. The way I like to do this, deviating off of academia a bit and making it a bit more practical, especially if I don't have a diagram in front of me, is to focus based on pivot point. Pivot points are the key to me to functionalizing this and making this practical. Okay, so I'm going to focus on pivot points. I'm in a fight stance. Notice we're depicted from the side. I'm facing this direction. My tools are facing this direction. The first line, the start of me as a fighter, is the tip of my knuckle or the tip of my toe. Okay, so this starts me as a fighter. This is my entry. This is my contact point, my first contact point as a target. Again, remember, zone theory is targeting centric. It's a targeting centric platform. So the first target that a person can hit on me is my knuckle or my toe. Okay, so when I'm facing this way, that is the barrier of the beginning of me. That's the starting point. And that is the first line. So the first line goes here. The second line cuts in right about the wrist here. Okay, so that's my second. My first zone is this little section. This is a target. This can be used to be hit. And notice this pivot point here. It said using pivot points is the way to functionalize this. Think of the wrist pivot point as my first zone. Because depending on how this is shaped, if this is shaped as a fist, it's easier to destroy than if this is faced as a palm, which can catch strikes. So if I have a palm here, if I have caught 2 catchers, I can actually catch a punch, which won't hurt me. It's not a valid target. But if I have a fist, okay, it can be punched and destroyed. It makes it a valid target. So this is our first depth zone, the wrist pivot point. The next depth zone is, starting at the wrist here to the elbow joint. Notice this flexes here, okay? So this section in here is our next depth zone. So I have depth zone 1 going to the wrist, depth zone 2 going to the elbow. Notice this thing. Notice this flexes here. If I'm like this in a fight, for whatever reason, depth zone 1 and 2 are not available. They are not available. The fight starts at depth zone 3. Okay, depth zone 3. And also, by the way, notice I'm focused on the upper body because I feel like it's easier to understand when you focus on the upper body. But this also applies to the lower body as well. Okay, depth zone 1, depth zone 2. Collapse like this, they're not available. So now depth zone 3. Depth zone 3 starts here at the elbow pivot point and goes to the shoulder pivot point. So the space between the elbow and this pivot point here is depth zone 3. Okay, depth zone 3. So I got depth zone 1, the wrist is my guide. Depth zone 2, my elbow is my guide. Depth zone 3, my shoulder is my guide. Okay, the next guide is center line. This is our axis rotation line. This is the spike that drives right through our body. This allows me to pivot and rotate. All right, that is my next divided line for my next depth zone. So I have depth zone 1, 2, 3, 4 connects the shoulder here, this pivot point, to the center. Okay, so that's 4 depth zones. There's 4 from the center out to the body. And again, just like the height zones and width zones, the Venetian blind principle applies here, and also the expand and collapse it element of it applies here, meaning different width zones can be different, different depth zones can be taken away. Like here, I've taken away, if I'm here, I'm taking away different depth zones, okay? If I'm out here, all depth zones are available, okay, along the upper line. The rear has 3, okay? Remember, there's 7 in total. The rear, so the 4, center line, out to the shoulder pivot point, to the elbow pivot point, to the wrist. Those lines create the 4 depth zones. On the rear side, I have the center to the shoulder here. This space creates the 5th depth zone. 5th. That's the rear. From here, I have, taking a fight stance this way, I have the shoulder to the knee. Maybe shoulder to knee. Okay, shoulder to knee. Alright, for classic fight stance. And then the final, last but not least, is the knee to the rear heel. Knee to the rear heel. Okay? So all of these are valid depth zones of targeting. The interesting thing is, you don't always have to have a head-to-head or neutral force alignment with someone. What do I mean by that? Well, if I'm facing someone, this is a neutral force alignment, meaning he's facing me and I'm facing him, and we're duking it out. Pow! We're trading blows. We're fighting. Sometimes I have an angular force alignment. Angular force alignment, I'm fighting this way and he's fighting that way. Notice all my depth zones are exposed. When someone is facing me this way, all my depth zones are exposed. Okay, so this is called an angular force alignment. He's fighting down my center line, and my firing line's going that way. That's an angular force alignment. And then also, this way, this is called a net force alignment, where he's attacking me from the rear. Okay, this is a net force alignment. Notice, when I'm talking depth zone theory, notice what depth zones are open. It's the rear 3 that are open. When I'm in net force line, I'm fighting that way, he's fighting that way. We're both fighting that way, and he's getting my back. That's where that heel and these rear depth zones really fully manifest themselves. Okay, so we've covered height zones, we've covered width zones, we covered depth zones. What about time zones? Time zones, interesting, huh? Ed Parker doesn't talk about time in his book. I always call Ed Parker the Isaac Newton of martial arts, because he always focused on height, depth, and width and space, right? Whereas he kind of ignored time to some degree, large degree actually. That's where Einstein came in and usurped Sir Isaac Newton. Einstein said, hey, whoa, you can't forget about time. You can't forget about time. This is where Bruce Lee really kicked in, because he made time the hero, and he said, look, there's different targets that are better to hit at different times in a fight. Okay? So when we talk zone theory, if you have a zone theory for height, and you have a zone theory for width, and a zone theory for depth, you have to have a zone theory for time. Okay? So what is our zone theory for time? What is our zone theory for time? Well, when? When do we hit them? Do we hit them before, during, or after? And that is awesome. So to use an example of a punch launches from point of origin, thrusts toward the target, hits point of pressure, and then retracts. Okay? So the 3 parts: thrust, point of pressure, and retraction. Before, during, after, time zones are when we hit our target during the apex of that punch. So for example, when this punch winds up here and I get hit, boom, well that's a before. If I wind my punch and I get hit here, boom, well that's a during. And if I go one and I pull it back, boom, and I get hit on the retraction, well that's an after. before, during, or after the apex of the punch. Those are the time zones. Another example, he's going to wind up. See this punch? So it's thrusting, getting point of pressure, and retracting. All right, so when he goes to thrust, boom, and I hit him with an eye jab, that's before. If he goes, and I hit him with an elbow destruction, well, that's during, because he hit him with point of pressure. Supposing he goes, boom, and I dodge it, boom, and I hit him this way, well, that's an after. That's an after. We have height zones, width zones, depth zones, time zones, and they all cleanly match to the 4 dimensions of physics. We have obscure zones, which are any target that gets hit out of field of vision. So it's a little, the interesting thing about obscure zones is they play with your perceptions. It's what Ed Parker called perceptual speed, to seem faster than you really are. Okay, so an example of an obscure zone, supposing I trapped and punched this fellow. Trapped and punch. So I'm trapping and punching. Notice where this hand is. It's now checking the arm. It's actually outside of the field of vision. Field of vision comes out as a cone going about this way. So when I hit here, whenever I hit a target out of a zone of obscurity, that is the obscure zone. I'm hitting the target out of a zone of obscurity. Remember, zones are a target-centric concept. Target-centric. So this is how we categorize target. Rather than focus on body parts, like I'm going to hit him in the solar plexus, I'm going to poke him in the eye, I'm going to slap him in the ear, I'm going to destroy his fist. Zone theory gives you the ability to hit different regions of the body and yield effect without having to precisely hit every target perfectly. God, again, no one's like, I'm going to hit him in the solar plexus. Yeah, boom, I'm going to take this knuckle and hit him in the solar plexus. That's fantastic, but supposing the guy's got a real baggy shirt on. Supposing he's got long torso, baggy shirt. How do you know exactly the guy's got a big baggy shirt on it precisely where the solar plexus is? It's just sometimes hard to locate. But I know that if I hit him in the mid zone, I will get something of value. Okay, so boom, I may get him in the stomach. Boom, I may get him in the bladder. Boom, I may get him in the solar plexus. Who knows? Boom, I may even get his hand on his chest just to be able to push him. I mean, just to get space. Okay, so by targeting the zone, high, medium, low, I have a much higher probability of having a strategic effect on the opponent rather than just looking for precision targets and applying hope as a strategy. Hope is never a good strategy. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this stuff, let me know in the comments. I'll make more. Thank you very much.